Welcome to Funnel Reboot, the podcast that shares ideas on how to upgrade your lead generation. Here is your host, Glenn Schmeltzley.
Hey, Glenn here. Whether it's your first time joining or you've been subscribed, I want to welcome you to Funnel Reboot. Today, we get into a rarely talked about aspect of content. First, I need to remind you about the deadline for the retirement of the old Google Analytics, Universal Analytics. It's going to be fully transitioned to Google Analytics 4 by June 30th of 2023, and we need to start our preparation now. Information on how to push forward fast comes later in the show, and I have a special offer for people who want to take part in this. Please go to the show notes for details. One great thing the web has given us is the privilege to post content that shows buyers why they should buy from us. But we can very easily fall into treating this like a treadmill, pumping out topic after topic of content. Though this hyperactivity may look good on our status reports, and of course please the search engines, is that who really matters in this endeavor? Kind of reminds me of the movie Jurassic Park, as financier John Hammond briefs the mathematician Malcome on how they made the dinosaurs. Malcome scolds him for tinkering with the very building blocks of life by saying,
"Genetic power is the most awesome force the planet's ever seen, but you wield it like a kid that's found his dad's gun."
I don't think you're giving us our due credit. Our scientists have done things which nobody's ever done before.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
In the same way, we should think about the person that's consuming our content, pausing not only to ask if we can create a piece of content for them, but to ask if we should create it. Judging what content gets made is a time-honored skill. News media and the publishing industry have formalized it into the role of editor. And today, we'll talk with someone with an editorial background to learn how they think so we can judge our content just like they do. My guest spent 16 years as senior level journalist and editor at top Canadian news outlets such as the Globe and Mail, CBC.ca, and the Ottawa Citizen. She then directed the content for not-for-profits and organizations like Export Development Corporation. She is happy to share what she's learned about digital communications on the stage at TEDx or as a lecturer at Carleton University, where she originally received her journalism degree. She has now moved into creating content under her own banner as owner of Big Stride Media, and she lives in the Ottawa suburb of Canada with her husband and 2 sons. Let's go hear from Melanie Coulson. Very glad to welcome Melanie Coulson. Welcome to Funnel Reboot, Melanie.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
I'm very glad to. Tell us a little bit about your background and give us a sense of how you, even though you are now doing content marketing, you did not at all begin with that.
No, and it's funny because I can remember way back in grade school, some guidance counselor telling us we'd have 8 careers in our life and thinking, oh yeah, sure, whatever. And at that point I had wanted to be an English teacher. So already I'm way far from that, but I've always had a love of stories. And ended up going to journalism school, did a master's in journalism school, and started a career in journalism, and very quickly moved from television. I always thought I wanted to be a documentary maker because I grew up loving 60 Minutes,
right?
To online news. So started at CBC News online, and then became the first hire, and this makes me sound like an absolute dinosaur, but the first hire for globeandmail.com. So I helped set up the Globe and Mail's breaking news website. And boy, it was ugly. There was all shades of tan in there, and but it was really about a culture shift, and it was really about telling stories, specifically news, in a breaking news format. So from there, started a career for 16 years actually in journalism. Still sound like a dinosaur, and then moved into communications and creating content with, I like to say, with a purpose, with an intent.
Sure. And I think that's a really key point here, that we are all glutted with information, right? And we are all glutted with facts. That isn't, that may be how you begin to gather and draft, but that is definitely not where you end up with when you're making a story, right? So maybe can you give us just a little bit of Melanie's philosophy of how we go from raw input to final output?
And that's kind of frightening that I would have a philosophy, but let me wax poetic.
Okay.
It's not unlike journalism in that you start with a lot, right? So what a true journalist, anyway, in the way I was schooled, you're completely objective and you're just trying to get as much information as you can. And from there, you need to narrow it down. I think the difference with content marketing is you're starting with an objective and you're starting with an intent and understanding what your audience is. So who am I speaking to and what do I want them to do? Those are the two key pillars for me in terms of creating great content. And when you see great content, you're like, they got it. They know exactly who it is they're targeting. They know exactly what they want you to do. So, if there was a philosophy, I've always been audience driven, audience centric. The more you can know about your audience, the better, and the better content you'll create as well. So I would start there. Like, who is it you're targeting? Who is your target audience? And sometimes there's more than one audience, but if we're marketing and we're trying to convert to sales or leads, who is that person? And then what's their pain point? Like, understand a little bit about them and then create content around that addresses that pain point.
Right. Could be a diverse audience too. And that gives us a little bit more of a challenge. I guess we have to organize what we have. So if we are, let's say, using our website as the hub for where this content sits, we have to imagine that different people are going to need different things. And by the time that's all, up and sitting on the site, we can't just, let them try to,
so
just graze through it, right?
Yeah, two things there. And I'm just going to take a little note to circle back to the second thing. You're absolutely right in that content has a life cycle, and you should absolutely be keeping track of your content when it might stale date or it's time to sunset it or update it, in terms of, no one wants to be out of date, out of touch with their audience, or because things live on the web, forever. I tend to, when I was creating content about companies, every quarter, every half a year, check in and make sure that company's still going, right? If you're going to do a company profile, little things like that are, they can
or you've quoted somebody and they no longer work at the company where,
Right. Well, that's not so bad, but what if the person you've quoted now has, gone up in flames in headlines and is no longer...
Good point.
Subway probably got rid of Jared content pretty quickly off its site. I'm going to say there's a good example. That's an obvious example. It speaks to the point. The other point I wanted to just raise is you had said if all our content lives on our site, just keep in mind that content marketing isn't always website driven. So if we go back to that first tenement of the audience is everything, maybe the audience doesn't go to melaniecoulson.ca. But maybe the audience hangs out on LinkedIn. Well, guess what? I'm creating all my content on LinkedIn and I'm targeting them that way. So content doesn't need to necessarily be created first for the web platform. That's why I always think you should go to your audience first. So, if I'm targeting someone who lives on TikTok, I'm not posting stuff on Pinterest, right? I'm going to create content that lives on TikTok. And frankly, no one's more afraid of me creating content for TikTok than my kids. But there you have it. That's my point, I think, illustrated there. But definitely there's a life cycle and a governance to your content as you're creating. And I hope I'm not making it sound more complex than it needs to be. It's just a case of being strategic about the content you're creating.
Sure. But let's just dwell on that for a minute. the multimedia nature of things can sometimes throw people for a loop. They may think that if they're going to put something on TikTok, that they have to come up with a completely new framework for how they create that. What's your take? Do we, at its core, do we still begin with an outline and then we maybe draft up a bit of a script? Now we do need to add audio elements, video elements, of course, but does it sort of begin the same way that we would begin a written piece?
So I think it's the strategy around it would still begin the same in terms of, and if that's a major piece of content too, I think absolutely you would start with what's the strategy, what's the objective, what's your measure of success. So if you're just starting out in this, how are you going to say at the end of the day, yes, we told a lovely story, but how do we know it worked? And that's where it's very different to journalism. We'll just tell stories that are hopefully fair and balanced, and that's it. But I think as journalism got ended, we realized we need to validate the work we're doing. And definitely as a content marketer, you need to validate the content you're creating with, it had this many conversions, or,
Right.
It had this many leads, or it led people to do this. Or frankly, maybe it's a learning. People hate our videos. Okay, well, let's stop doing videos. Let's stop wasting money on that, right? And frankly, it's usually the reverse. They love your videos.
Yes.
And you had a question about TikTok there too. And I am not a TikTok expert, so let's not frame me that way. I don't think that people should be fearful ever of experimenting with content. And I think like your phone, and I'm, holding up my phone right now, makes it so much easier and accessible. However, the flip side of that, like anyone can tweet anything, any picture, in seconds.
Yeah.
The flip side of that is, but is it strategic? So often you see people doing things because they can. And sometimes the simplest strategic thinking, the clever is what converts.
Yes, and I think we're getting right into the heart of things now. And you, I guess, being that we're both about the same age, and we're both remembering back to '90s movies, I got to bring up Jurassic Park and Jeff Goldblum's line about he was saying after they'd explained that the scientists had done all this wonderful genetic engineering and created these huge things again, he said, your scientists thought about whether they could or not, but they didn't ask whether they should. And I feel so much that content is like that we could go in every direction, and that's exhilarating, but it can be completely wasteful if we don't give ourselves a moment to ask things that a journalist would ask. So like maybe start us off with how we might do some of that line of questioning, or maybe what happens inside the world of journalism and media when there's a person who wants to write the story and the person who edits or publishes the story. What does that conversation sound like, to try to figure out, before we've spent our time putting in the content, what do we have to stop and ask ourselves first?
Yeah, I think you've raised a great point. Goldblum and dinosaurs aside, I think that question of should we do it is a great one. Because you could spend millions creating content,
right?
Or you could do something as simple as a little shareable graphic that Oreo did during the Super Bowl when the lights go out, says you can still dunk in the dark, and get crazy impressions that exceed what they could have ever gotten with a paid Super Bowl ad.
Correct.
So it really is about being clever. And frankly, I have never worked in an organization that said to me, Melanie, here's an open budget. Like,
spend what you need.
And so it's always been like, how are you spending? And I actually had one leader who said to me, if you were to measure in hours the amount of time you're investing in this content and the amount of conversions we're getting, how does that look? And I'm like, ooh, I don't know if we want to do that math, but you definitely need to pick and choose. Yeah. And again, that should we do it? I think you got to center it around your audience, and will it reach your audience? Will it speak to them in a way that's targeted, and will it convert? And so I'm a huge fan of incremental tests, right? Play with something. I've been playing on my own LinkedIn channels with articles, and what kind of things are grabbing people's attention, and what kind of things are, people commenting on or sharing, and what are people just ignoring? And so it's like, okay, well, that didn't fly very well. So mental note, don't do that again. I mean,
yes,
there is a certain level of testing as you're learning your audience too, and how to speak to your audience. And there's a part of like that. We're at the top of the funnel here with a lot of this content we're creating. Super top of the funnel. It's brand building too. And then your crafted content customized for that audience who's already a customer. It's a very special, different beast, but
yes,
most of the content we see out in the ecosystem is top of the funnel.
right.
Yeah.
And when it's like that, and you're trying to, let's say, put yourself in the reader's shoes, you must have some times where you can tilt your story in more than one way. Perhaps the questions that they're asking, maybe they're skeptical of the company, and you have a choice to make of, well, do I lean into that, and do I kind of play into their skepticism, and then maybe explain to them, well, when you're buying from this kind of company, here's the risk that they have on their side. And so maybe you end up trying to give that person an appreciation that they shouldn't be so skeptical. Or you can, try to plow ahead and just not address the skepticism and say, here's all the reasons why we're good. Do you think that it's a good idea to explore some of those differences? You talked about seeing what grabs the reader. That would be, to me, one way to do it.
Yeah, you're right. I think there's different ways of creating, different reasons for creating content. Some of it is to talk about how awesome your product or service is, of course, right? Like
we all love to do that.
Yeah, and that's the easiest one. But frankly, does that really make people passionate about what you do? I'm not sure, right? But what I think we're seeing brands do with their content, and this is what I am a huge heart. I believe that content is heart to heart. And I think that what we're seeing brands do is speak more about their values. And that really, especially Roe versus Wade was a great example of companies stepping forward. Like Patagonia saying they will pay for anti-abortion, pro-choice folks who are incarcerated to get them out of jail, right? So things like that, or to fly people to another state to get an abortion. Like you have companies stepping up, and sure, that's absolutely winning over their audience, but it's taking a stand on things we've never seen before, frankly. So I do see a lot of content being created in those companies representing who they are, their brand values, which is beyond the traditional, we sell great sweaters.
Correct.
Right? I mean, yeah, you sell sweaters that'll last forever, Patagonia, way to go. You sell sweaters that my kids, 30 years, when my husband, my kids think they're so super trendy and cool, and they still last. Perfect. But now Patagonia's doing this, and it's like, you know what? I have a different reason to love this brand. And that's where I think that connection is made. And I love, like, Gartner Marketing Research has done this great infographic of like own, buy, and advocate for brands. And I think that's the beauty of great content marketing. It can take you from own and buy into advocate, right? So you're actually someone walking around going, this is a company that means something to me. And I do think that there is a huge group of consumers, of people out there who believe in what they wear and what they buy and what they do. And like, so it's in a brand's interest to say, this is who we are. Like, and think about, I'm going to throw Chick-fil-A out there, and maybe now we're off content marketing, but how many people turned away from Chick-fil-A because of what they stand for as well?
Right.
Or, and conversely, there's another group, another audience that
they are trying to attract, right? You define dark by defining light. Yes, of course. Absolutely. Contrast.
You may want to, I
don't know. The other place that I think we can see this is, and I'm speaking specifically of the advocacy, or like you say, maybe controversy, is that brands, because they're posting on social platforms, comments follow the piece. And
that makes people curious, doesn't it?
Right. And then the brand has a choice. Do we weigh in on that? What do we do there? So I think this, conversation that I'm imagining, like a journalist and their assignment editor have, I think this needs to be hammered home as the brand is putting out this content, they need to know what their stance is going to be, because their audience is likely going to expect a response.
Yeah, and in the newsroom, we had general commenting policies. And at the early days of globemail.com, all comments had to be moderated. And I still remember, like, each of us would take a 1 hour shift and we'd call it going into the trenches and approving comments, denying comments, or, going through and wading through all the various comments. And you really do get to see a wide variety of the world.
Oh, I'm sure you can lose faith in humanity if you do too much of it.
Your days. And then you had like non-moderated or waiting for flagged comments in newsrooms too. I saw that come through. But I also think that we had a strong policy around what was acceptable discourse and what was not. And I think that's what brands need to do too. As soon as if you're going to open up, that discussion, you need to be aware of, okay, this is as far as we'll let the debate go on our turf. And then you might fall into the place of, and we're way off content marketing right now, but like Nestle, for example, which people have started attacking Nestle for using palm oil in its Kit Kat bars, I think it was. And so then it became it devolved into this discussion about whether Nestle should be there. And then they took someone's comments down and they were like, it's our page. I mean,
yeah.
Have a set plan as to how you're going to host the discourse, if you're going to host the discourse. I don't want to frighten people, though, Glenn, from creating great content. It is possible to create content that's not controversial, that people will fall in love with. And I think, again, I'm going to go back to Oreo. They do it so well, right? It's a cookie, but they do it so well in sharing that content. And want a Canadian example? I guess I'll give you Canadian Tire and their Jumpstart program. Every Olympics, Paralympics, they've got me in tears. It's just,
yep.
And that's TV spots, but I've also seen them online. I also see the images. Like, it's a very well executed campaign.
Yes.
Right here in Canada. It's all around a central content theme, right? And it's going for those folks who they know their audience. It's fiercely Canadian, fiercely proud. And they're going after folks who love sports or who love equality or love. In the Jumpstart program, it's like inclusiveness. It's a message of making sure everyone's included as well, which I think is a pretty great message as well.
I think the amount of time that a marketer should spend with other groups, with their customer service teams, with their product management teams, or, in cases like that, their merchandisers, to try to find those use cases, to try to uncover maybe specific stories. This is the kind of investigation that makes journalists so good at what they do.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Glenn. Like, when I worked at United Way, one of the most impactful moments I had was we were trying to tell the story of youth homelessness in Ottawa.
Okay.
And I still remember going out, working with the Youth Services Bureau and meeting Nathan, who was like a 17-year-old kid who lived on the street. So articulate, right?
Wow.
And was able to tell me, my parents kicked me out when I told them I was homosexual. I have mental health problems. And so he showed us where he slept. And this was a kid who, at that time, I have two boys. One was like 10 at the time. And I thought, there is nothing separating Nathan from who my kids are, right? Like, it's circumstance. Like, so being able to hear his story helped me be able to tell his story, and it can create that connection. So I absolutely agree. You have to get out of the office. And that's something we used to say to journalists as well when I was in the newsroom, is like, get out of the office and go see it, go smell it, go experience it, and talk to the people who are in it. Talk to your customers, find out, what their problems are. If they have trouble, if there's supply chain issues or shipping issues, like, what are the real struggles that they deal with from day to day? And then from there, you're like, okay, so this is something that we can help them with, or this is a way we can approach them.
Mm-hmm. We have to sometimes guide other people to write these stories. I'm thinking particularly of technical things where a knowledge expert needs to be in there somewhere. Any tips on, do we let them take a crack at a draft, or do we interview them, or do we find some way to involve them, maybe even ghostwrite for them? I don't know, but how have you seen it work where we take something that you need to have that, years of experience to say. Um, this is one of the things I just love about journalists because they figure out a way to know how to do from one moment to the next something in areas where other people spend their lives. So, help me out there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, so as a journalist, I remember working in TV at CBC Edmonton. And one day I went out and interviewed a sheep farmer who was using his sheep to cut the grass in Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta. And then the next day I interviewed a scientist who had created a bandage for burn victims with silver in it. So like you have to pivot like that all the time.
Couldn't be more different. Yeah.
No, but at the same time, you're absolutely right. I was never the expert. I was never the sheep farmer. I was never the scientist who created silver bandage. So our role as content marketers is absolutely to it's almost like translator. And I've worked with a lot of economists and taking that, again, who is your audience? The economists aren't necessarily, when I'm getting my hands on it as a content marketer, I'm not writing for a university crowd. I'm not writing for other economists. I'm trying to write it so that, for example, someone working in city council in Nova Scotia understands why they need to raise bridges in the case of an environmental economist. So that kind of thing is, you absolutely work as a translator. So in terms of logistics and how best to do it, you mentioned a couple of them there. I absolutely think you have to include them or you could lose your credibility.
They've had brand recognition, I bet. I mean, they've probably been asked to speak to their peers on a stage, right?
Have our chief economist speaking. That sounds pretty great, right? But at the same time, because you are a translator, I often think that an interview or a Q&A is a really great way to kind of get all the information we need to then tell the story. And as a journalist, I would often use the phrase, can you explain this to me like I'm a 6-year-old? That does it, right? So I remember riding an elevator with a fantastic economist who specialized in South America. And I'm like, we got 12 floors. Can you just tell me what's going on in Brazil? And she's like, okay, let's go. Right. And explain the whole Brazilian economy and what was going on and in 12 floors. And I think that's the goal of us as content marketers. Excuse me. That's the goal of content marketers, is to have that ability to translate from the expert to the audience. And so it's a role I love, frankly, because it gives you opportunity to learn as a content marketer too. Like, think about how challenging and exciting your day is. I was doing some writing for just straight up writing for a Practical Nurses magazine recently, and got to interview some nurses about their day and what COVID meant. And it was so fascinating to learn about challenges they may have had with vaccines and what they were seeing and with overloaded patient cares, et cetera. And I think it's a huge opportunity for content marketers to be in that role of translating from the very technical aspects to an audience that, in that case, it was a knowledgeable audience as well. So I had to make sure that I didn't sound like a complete, fool who was not a nurse.
Right. Yeah. There will be different ones.
And I love the idea of engaging that expert, because you absolutely need them. And oftentimes it can mean sending them a draft and saying, have I got this right? And as a journalist, we wouldn't send a whole story, but I might send them a paragraph and say, have I described your silver dressing correctly?
Okay.
And there's nothing wrong with doing that. And to the point where sometimes it becomes a very good conversation. I think we're all grown-ups. We can have them where the expert might say, well, but you really should use this word. And I'll say, okay, but my audience doesn't understand that word, so I need to find a different way. So that's okay, right? Especially when it's, a higher academic field, you definitely are massaging language quite a bit.
Sure. The vision that it's sometimes been said to me in is it's like a pyramid, right? And so in the message pyramid, the things that you could see, for example, from a satellite in space would be, just on the outside of the pyramid, just the top and, the overall shape. And if we can try and talk with the knowledge expert who probably understands every single block of that thing down to the catacombs, we're saying to them, yeah, you'll lose the person who's flying by in a plane. Just give me the stuff that, right?
To go back to Jurassic Park's, situation, Bloom is probably not what the guy sounds like, who is the dinosaur expert. He probably speaks in a way that we could not understand, right? Jeff Goldblum is the lovely translator. He's the content marketer, right?
Totally.
Saying it for a general audience, because I'm quite sure that there is, oh my gosh, now I'm going to say, not my field, but like a paleontologist or something, or some dinosaur who would say things that we would just have to say, what? Like, huh? Who knows? I'm sure there's tons of Jeff Goldblums out there as well, but they're generally teachers, right? Teachers are great translators as well.
That's right. So we got to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to talk about how we will do the distribution part of this, because media still does have a part to play in how we can help get our message out. Need to break away from our conversation for a message about something that almost every marketer is affected by. Google moving us from Universal Analytics, or UA, to Google Analytics 4. After June 30, 2023, GA4 will be the only way to see our analytics. Its data is all new, too, meaning there's no easy way to bring UA reports you knew and loved to the GA4 interface. Since GA4 only starts collecting data once it's installed, companies wonder how they'll get everything, both past and future data, reported through this new interface. Is the only option to make it all over from scratch? No, there's another way. All the web analytics data that's in the interface is also available in Google's cloud database. B2B companies have data in silo systems that could be combined with this raw data to see their entire funnel. This enables you to fetch answers you'd never get from the old Google Analytics. You can use data anywhere in your company, visualize interactions with prospects to better learn how they like to be treated. Have people who always ask for the same data? Make an automated dashboard for them. The learning curve for marketers here is steep. That's why I am leading a live workshop to get you there. The GA Fast Forward workshop goes beyond installing GA4 and setting up conversions with Tag Manager. You'll learn how to normalize data coming from ad platforms and internal systems and pipe them to Google Cloud. Google Data Studio will then present it in the best way for getting your story across. By working directly on the tools for 2 days plus post-workshop support, you'll become very confident in using them. The first workshop is in Ottawa this October. It's also being held in other cities, so put yourself down to be notified when yours comes up. Those who want to take advantage of the Google Analytics stack should check out this program by visiting gafastforward.com. You can spell forward with the numeral 4 in the middle, as in GA4, or the normal spelling of the words to get there. That's it for the message. Good so far?
How do you feel?
Yeah, it's happening. Okay. It's good.
Just edit it out to make me sound smart.
Me too. And we're back. So, Melanie, I wanted to talk about the role that the media still plays, and we can do our best. You're right. When we were talking earlier about controversy, I mean, let's be honest. Most people in their own experience, if they do put something on their website, they're not going to get jeers and sneers. They're going to get crickets, right?
Yeah.
So this is the reality that we're at. So we need to begin to have our content seen by more people so that we can at least understand whether or not it's catching any readers. You don't get to the I've offended people if you don't even get to the I have people. Right?
You're not suddenly see millions of website visits just because you created a blog post.
No. So the
blog post in the world. But
right. But yeah, we don't want it to be the tree in the forest that falls and nobody hears it.
Exactly.
So we can do this a few ways. We can get, if we are lucky enough to have some channels that are active. We might be able to get some user-generated content, right? We could solicit and see how people are giving us, or maybe story ideas. We can start to talk to other experts. Maybe we can even do a pitch to a journalist or to someone who has a site that is there to publish things that are in our industry, our domain. Where would you start with any of that?
Well, I guess it's again, we're going to start with audience and your objective. What's the best way to reach them? And are they, what's their demographic? What are their habits, right? Where do they take in or ingest most of their media? If they're traditional media folks, like traditional media is great for general public.
Right.
But there are huge opportunities with custom content in traditional media and non-traditional media, frankly. You can buy segments of the news. I did that. I bought the 6 o'clock news for a series of weeks, and we ran custom content that we designed the script. We told them who to interview, and they went and executed. We actually had final approval before it went to air. And then the president of the organization said to us, "You guys are on the news all the time. It's fantastic."
It's uncanny.
I'm like, I know. It's like Wednesdays at 6:10 p.m. It's crazy. But as a journalist, that broke my heart. However, as a content marketer, I'm like, that's gold, right? Like there's that brand recognition that you have that minute every Wednesday that's popping up and reminding viewers who happen to be our target audience. Not happen to be, they were our target audience. So we knew what we were doing, and that just reaches them that way. And there's custom content on sites. There's custom content in print.
So and it's known by other names, right? Like what else have you heard it called?
Editorial. So
right.
We as journalists, I think, make ourselves feel better by calling it custom content, right? But you're right, it's advertorial. But
or even you could even say it's native advertising, where there are large enough swaths of a web page where you can fit the first 100 words.
Sure, that's a little different. I'm talking about stories that are closer to an actual story. So in the case of the TV news spots that we purchased,
yes,
they had the anchor would introduce it. They would interview folks for it, 2 or 3 people in that minute, and have their clips. So it was very much like, to anyone, including my mother, you would just watch it and say, "Oh, that's a news piece."
Yes.
So it's not so much advertorial, like I'm thinking of the 1950s ads where you need to use borax to get your stains out of your shirt.
Yeah.
It's very, very, you're right, native, I guess I would say, in terms of almost disguised.
Yeah.
As
blends.
Initial content. So there's that way to get your message out. I would also say partner amplification is huge for a lot of organizations. Creating content on their site, them creating content on yours, sharing it on their platform, them sharing it. You know what I'm saying? Everybody shares each other's content. If you're in an organization that has partner organizations, that is a huge way to reach people you wouldn't normally reach. And that is, I think, under leveraged by a lot of organizations. Maybe not companies, private companies, but in this town where we've got tons of associations,
right?
Everybody knows what town we're in, right?
I think, Ottawa, right? So, but I think in technology, I mean, the best example I can give is if people peered under the hood of most hardware type content, they would see that there's a software company that helped, and vice versa, right?
Yep.
I mean, the success of Microsoft is owed largely to, talking about, isn't this a great Dell or a great Toshiba or a great HP? It wasn't them doing it. It was Microsoft doing it, because those are all Windows-based machines.
You're right. So those kind of partner plays for sure. And then you've got your social channels as well. So I would think about how you can also boost content, organic content on your social channels. And the algorithms on many of these channels prefer organic content over an ad. So it's in your favor to think about, and on LinkedIn and Facebook being cheaper, you can target by geography, by interest. It's uncanny. And I know that Facebook's recently changed its advertising rules, but there are different ways to kind of reach your audience. And I often think that we think traditionally around content around, let's put it on the website. that's not always your only avenue. In fact, sometimes you should think about creating content just for a channel. Like maybe this just goes on my Instagram and it doesn't fit anywhere else.
Right.
And that's where it lives, and that's where it gets eyeballs, and that's where you interact with people.
Yeah, good point. The places that we've talked about where, let's say, there is a publisher in our space, some industry journal, if we're going to try to work with them, I think that that's a great example where we say, look, we're not going to do the borax double spread,
Right.
Advertorial.
I was at the Globe. This was way back. It was $5,000 for an 8-page ad, and now it's like I think it's 4 or 5 times that. And like, who sits with the paper anymore? I mean, I love news.
Right.
Don't get me wrong, but
Right.
I sit in bed with the paper every morning on a Saturday.
Yeah.
It's also much simpler, sadly. I mean, those display ads are not having the impact they once had. You need to figure out.
Of course not. Right. So as you say, kind of if you're going into that channel, let's call it, then you need to think about how they look at things. And one thing that's come through very clearly from what you've said there is we have to dial down the my product is great. So what would be, even thinking back to the one where you had the 610 spots on the news, where did you go with those stories? Did you focus on a customer profile? Did you talk about a long-term employee? What kinds of things did you do where you were selling without saying that you're selling?
So in that case, I was working in fundraising. So we really wanted to impact. So it was a story about the places where we were making an impact. So we're in that case, because it's fundraising, we're trying to connect the donor who's watching with where their dollar is going. So you give me $1, here's how it's changing a life, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think that's the one thing that even if we think we're out of ideas on what content to create, we can't forget we're human. And that those, in the news business, they call it human interest story, right? So we can't forget that's something we can always go to. It's a deep well, and there are tons of stories in there.
There are so many stories. And in fact, people, I think, don't recognize that they are surrounded by stories every day, and that they have stories to tell. Like, you have a story to tell. Everyone does. Everyone has a story that connects us as we hear each other's stories. And I do think that as marketers, as communicators, we need to think about the channels. I mean, owned, earned, paid, and social. Absolutely. But we also need to think about how we're going to connect and how we're going to tell a story that does connect and resonate. I think you mentioned Intel earlier. One of the best Intel ads I've ever seen was it was about how it sponsored a science contest in the U.S. and the guy who won it, his dad or uncle had died of a horrible cancer, liver, I can't remember where, and he had done all this research towards it, and it was like groundbreaking research, and all these folks early, in universities had said, "Good luck with that, sir." He kept at it, and 4 years later, he came up with some sort of treatment or cure for the disease, and he won the prize, which was sponsored by Intel. And I'll send you the link. It's an absolutely moving commercial, and it's only at the end that you see the Intel logo, right? And it's about, and the tagline is something about driving innovation. Yes. The whole point of the story is about this kid and how this kid worked so hard in his uncle or father's memory to do this. And like, that's a story we can all go, wow, that's a great story. Well, actually, and then Intel has connected its brand to that great story.
Sure.
So it's a different way of thinking about Intel, right?
They've put that person right at the center of the stage, and they're, practically the one who's just pulling the curtain, rope as the stage is closing. They're almost off stage, but you remember all this time later that they were linked.
I think I talked about it at a Social Ottawa conference, like way back when social networking was new, Social Odd or something, way back in 2010, maybe. Like, that's how old it is. And yet I still can recall that amazing commercial. And hopefully that kid is like gone on to solve other kinds of cancer problems. But
of course, yeah, that'd be great. But the
frankly, because until that time it was like, oh, it's the big Borg that makes computers, and now it's like, that's interesting that they sponsor a science competition. Like, that's cool.
Yeah. So
even
even for them, and they're chock full of engineers, right? But they had people inside their shop that thought outside what they do and looked at adjacent things, connected with human stories, and found a way to make it happen.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that in recruitment for sure right now, because it's an employee market.
Yes.
It's a highly competitive market. So you're seeing brands talking more about what they stand for, why they're a great place to work, who their people are. Like, you're seeing that as well. Like, even their own brand story about themselves in terms of trying to recruit others is changing. And it's more of that story or connectivity around the heart to heart as well.
Yeah, it has many different ways. And, that has just as much of a monetary gain for the company. Let's say that they, can forego spending on expensive recruiting. So any way that someone can use content, it doesn't have to strictly be at that top of funnel. You talked about earlier how we could use it to get existing customers to be advocates. There, you've just brought up the HR angle. I mean, there's a whole host of different ways that it's to be taken, and it's just amazing to me how parallel this is with the way that traditional media have always done this. An editorial, set of values, a set of assignments with, clear directives, deadlines, measurement, right? So before we, kick the newspaper to the curb and say, that was a time, it's a product of a bygone era, we should look and see how they did things and take the lessons.
Oh, absolutely. I think in many of the places that I've worked, we've set up almost a newsroom model. So you have your experts who create video, experts who create photo, much as you'd have a photo department or video department in news organizations, copy editors, fact checkers. Like, it's very similar. I actually dubbed, when I was at United Way, I dubbed the vice president of marketing communications. I was like, you're like our publisher, right? And we decided, no, actually the CEO is the publisher. He's the managing it, right? So created this hierarchy where we did think of ourselves as a news outlet, creating content with a purpose. So you're not wrong at all there, Glenn. I do think I've used Agile a lot in my career.
Yes.
The Agile working methodology. And what struck me, I was like, this is our 9 a.m. story meeting. A stand-up is what we would do in news every morning at 9. And then at 3:30, we would get together. And I'm going to sound like a dinosaur. Dinosaurs is the sub-theme of this episode.
It sure is.
When I first started in journalism, I will confess that there was a front page meeting at 3:30 every day at the Globe. And so we would discuss.
And this is for the next morning's edition.
Right.
Okay.
We would discuss, and I was starting the website, remember? So there's that weird dichotomy of things like, well, can't we just put that on the website now?
I can press publish right now.
We can no, we have to wait because it's going in the paper tomorrow. So we would discuss at 3:30 how it has been going. Like, so when you think about the Agile methodology, like, those are all pieces that were inherent in the news process. So there's that as well. And I'm going to tell you a little story, an aside about knowing your audience. So one of the front page meetings that I was attending, there was only one other woman in the room at the Globe, and we were all senior editors, and we were talking about what to put on the front page. And they had just come out with a study that hormone replacement therapy for menopausal women it's highly linked to cancer, to breast cancer. I don't know if you remember that. And the men in the room were like, yeah, that's important, but I'm not sure that's that, interesting to our readers. And at the same time, they were debating, Canada had just gotten, and forgive me, the history for me on this one is not as strong, the purchase of F-35s, CF-35s.
Oh, okay. All right. So women's health versus kick-ass planes.
Exactly. And the other woman and I were like, hard lobbying for like HRT study should definitely go on the front page. Instead, we went half page, giant plane in the air. And we were just like, this is so boys and their toys. But we put the HRT story on page 14 or something. And I just thought, 50% of your readers are women. And like, don't forget your audience. So that was just another. I just always think
so what you're saying is, if
That
we follow this org chart and kind of bring it into our own companies, these are the kind of conversations we may expect to have, and they're healthy.
Oh, absolutely. And you may have to defend decisions around like, no, we're going to tell the story of the kid who won the science contest instead of the new chip in our laptop.
Or we just hired a new VP.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yes. So
Right.
there's always going to be content you have to create because somebody somewhere thinks it's important. But I do think that that's where metrics are your friend. So you could say, when we tell those stories, we get very little visits on that.
Right.
Here's a better way to just tell the stories.
Here's our proof. Love it.
Here's our proof, right? So it's not me being emotional or my gut reaction on, as great as Glenn is, the story about him becoming VP really didn't get a lot of traction versus the story of the kid who won the science test. Like we should find a better way to tell the story of Glenn becoming VP. And congrats on your promotion.
Thank you very much. The way you've described it for the company, like we began this whole conversation saying that, you can spend millions on content and,
you don't
waste it. You've helped lay out some things that make it not so scary and make it so that an organization can understand what you need to do to be able to have this. And I think the thing that every organization should remember is that these have a very long shelf life if they're evergreen. And you may, just like with the Intel contest, you may find that your particular offering, even if it's to a small esoteric audience, that years later, it was something that you said today that caused them to eventually become a customer.
You're right. And we haven't even talked about search engine optimization and becoming a thought leader in a space so that the next time someone Googles something about an area that you're a specialty in, you happen to have written about, it's like, oh, wow, they know about this. I need to dig into this and learn more about that company as well. So that's something to consider as well in terms of becoming an expert in a space or a thought leader in a space. But you're right. You could spend millions on content, but it's better to be smart about it, don't you think? And save the millions for the work party if we have those ever again. But
right. Well, arguably though, if we're getting into the refined tactics that you're mentioning now, somebody should just come talk to you. So if they're interested in doing that, Mel, knowing about you and Big Stride Media, how can they do that?
Well, thanks for the plug.
Sure.
I'm on LinkedIn. They can find me at bigstridemedia.com. And there's a contact us thing there. There's a phone number there, email, all that. But LinkedIn is probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. I'm on Twitter too, but frankly, get me on LinkedIn.
And what people get on LinkedIn is they get your regular content with your own personal take on things.
Yeah, I have a series of articles that I put out there weekly or biweekly of like great content done right. I did one today, actually, just after Canada Day. I was inspired by this amazing certificate of citizenship that came from Canada's Secretary of State. I didn't know we had that. 1979, to me as a 6-year-old, welcoming me to be a citizen. I think it's a great example of even government communications can be magical and inspiring. So I posted that up there today because I'm like, you know what? You never know when your documents are going to be saved and coveted. So content can be so great.
I don't think it's possible to listen to you and not believe that.
I'm so passionate about great stories. So I welcome the chance to talk to anybody about it. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on your show today.
I'm very glad. And to the listener, I'm glad that you have listened because I bet you've gotten value out of it a bit. And I hope that you take something that Mel says and help use it to make your funnel even better.
Thanks for listening. Follow the show on Twitter at Funnel Reboot. If you like what you have heard today, please consider leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts.